Billy, let's get up to speed from when the 7-9 disaster ended to where we are today. Unbelievable amount of changes with that Packer organization. Right at the very top with, obviously, Brian Gutekunst, who we'll hear from. He had his pre-draft news conference today. We'll have some of his highlights a little bit later on during the show. But he takes over for Ted Thompson, now the consultant of football operations, right? And then there's a completely new structure where there are coordinators for virtually every position group, and they're all answering to President and CEO Mark Murphy.
You're the radio coordinator.
Yeah, I'll be the media coordinator and work with Jason Wallers hand in hand. Both you guys, what did you think when the move was made with Ted, Brian stepping in, Mark Murphy taking control of this organization in a different way, the likes of which we haven't seen since, quite honestly, Judge Robert Perrins was making decisions, and not all of them good, to tell you the truth. But it's a lot different now.
Yeah, I think if you have a appreciation for history, you know that there is some reticence when you're aware of those struggles they had and the unclear nature of their flow chart, and having Tom Bratz have some measure of pull but not entirely. I mean, remember, Ron Wolf was brought in for an interview one time before the Packers actually hired him, and their structure scared him away. He said, I don't want to be part of this. And then when Bob Harlan became the president...
I'm reporting to the executive committee?
Right. And so when Bob Harlan became president and said, you will have full control over football operations, including hiring and firing the coach, that was important to a eventual Pro Football Hall of Fame GM. The fact that they have done this, we'll see how it works. I think it's intriguing. I think when you look at the fact that there were rumblings that Mike McCarthy and Aaron Rodgers did not want Russ Ball to be the general manager, I think you wonder how that factored into Mark Murphy's thinking. But the bottom line is, when the Minnesota Vikings had a triangle of authority, we all made fun of them.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? The Packers have a triangle of authority, and we'll see how it works for them.
Bill, Murphy's explanation and reasoning was this is going to clear up, open up, and facilitate more open lines of communication.
Silos.
Yes.
That was the word of the day.
Silos, yes.
You know, I don't know about any of that stuff. We'll see how it all works out, but it was time to make a change, GM. If you are captain, draft and develop like Ted Thompson, and your drafts aren't good enough, and your team has slowly gone downhill, it's time to make a change. Now, they can spin this as however they want to, but it was time to make a change, and I think we'll see how it works out, but I think it's changed for the better.
13-year run for the GM in that chair, but it didn't stop there because Mike McCarthy finally followed the hashtag FireCapers Twitter and made the move with his defensive coordinator, bringing Mike Pettin, bringing back Joe Philbin, changing several other offensive coaches, Jim Hostler as a passing game coordinator, Frank Signetti for Alex Van Pelt as passing game, or the quarterback coach. Patrick Graham is now working with the D-line and as a run D coordinator. This is as big of an overhaul as McCarthy has had probably since the Sanders Capers move was made just a couple of years into his tenure.
It's definitely a change in structure. He didn't change that many defensive assistants, which I thought was odd. I was a little surprised that there weren't more Pettin guys that came along for the ride. Basically, there's one. I'll be eager to see how that works out. Plus, Billy, you think about it, and as I think Vince Beagle mentioned when he was on with Tausch and I on our show a couple weeks ago, the coaches were still learning the defense, and now those guys have to try and teach this scheme to the players, and really there's only two players who have experience in this, Mo Wilkerson and obviously Tramon Williams. So I think it's going to be really interesting. We keep hearing this phrase, Billy, about I want to make it look complex but actually have it be simple. We saw so many communication problems with the previous defense. I think that's going to be a huge thing for them to improve on.
That's why you hope all those coordinators actually coordinate something, right? I mean, it was just, Josh Jones is the kind of the example of the guy who they put him into 18 million spots, which is 17.999 million too many, and it was just guys running wide open all the time. So you hope if you're the Packers that Joe Witt can straighten that stuff out, and the other coordinators can straighten all that other stuff out, because it was, for a team that always seemed to be building toward the end of the year, they just went downhill.
And the other thing we heard a lot about was it is going to tighten up the accountability. Players made no bones about the lack thereof at points last season. How do you think this will, as a lot of guys have told us when we got a chance to talk to them when they started the offseason program, there's no mess. There's no messing. I think HaHa put it that way. A likable, learnable defense, but there's no messing around. You're going to be accountable whether you're a rookie or a 10-year veteran.
Yeah, I think there was definitely that issue. I mean, if you hear players talking about that, because you would think players would actually be the opposite, right? That they want to be able to skate on a few things once in a while. And I think that became so pervasive that they realized that was one of the things that needed to change, that you couldn't have a play like you did in the Minnesota game at Lambeau late in the season where Jake Ryan has his back to the line of scrimmage and he's yelling at Clinton Dix or they're miscommunicating or something, and the ball is being snapped, and he's not even seeing the snap because he's busy having a conversation with That kind of stuff could not continue, but they have to figure out a way to not only eliminate that but also be more impactful, be more of a playmaking defense. The great thing about Dom Capers' defenses in the past had been they took the ball away so much, and that had not been the case in recent years.
Now, I'm excited to see what Pettine brings to the defense. Does it become a more aggressive defense and a defense that isn't as predictable as what we saw over time with Capers? It just seemed we know what we're going to be doing here. We know how to attack this, and you can count on communication breakdowns.
Yeah, change for the sake of change isn't good, but you're right. I mean, Dom had been in place for so long that he just got his ways, and I think if you're the opponent, you've seen this defense. If you're the Vikings, you've seen this defense 20 times over the years.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of mystery. They've got to figure out Clinton Dix, first and foremost. This new regime has got to figure out what they're going to do to him, because he went from a guy who looked like a budding star to a guy who spent all the games 20 yards off the line of scrimmage. He seemed bored to death, and his play went downhill in a hurry. They got to figure him out. I think that's almost a priority.
Well, that leads us to, all right, we've covered the front office, we covered the coaching staff, and now the roster overhaul. It began really with the trade, Demarius Randall for DeShone Kizer, and then the flop of the positions in the draft. Let's just start with that one. Randall time, now a Brownie.
Yeah, the fact that Mike McCarthy essentially admitted at the NFL meetings that they played the guy out of position the whole time, I think colors my judgment a little bit on him. I didn't enjoy covering him, frankly. He was truculent with the media, as Al Michaels once said about
Mark didn't
Rod
like it either.
Tidwell.
No.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to see if I could bait him into telling the story.
Wait till we're off air.
But I also think it's a little bit of addition by subtraction, because it tells you how much they were frustrated with him that they were willing to move on from a first-round pick, who I think people inside the building will tell you is talented, but there are other issues that
So
go
was
along
Buckley,
with it.
so was Ahmad Carroll. And neither one of them did enough, and they cut the ties awfully early on high picks. Both were number ones.
He's their only slot guy that they had. I mean, no offense to Lindsey Pipkins if you're listening, but he's their slot guy.
Right.
I realize he said he played him out of position, but he's who they had. Right. He had 4 picks, and to dump him for a guy who might never, ever, ever see the field outside of August, that kind of speaks volumes.
But who felt they were playing him out of position? Why didn't they get personnel in to get him into the right position?
Well, Mike McCarthy said he was a safety, and
Right.
that was what he. Whether or not, I think Bill's right though. As a slot guy, you can have your slot guys be safeties.
Absolutely.
And I think that was, if you remember in training camp, the conversation, they called it the star position.
Right.
And that was where he was supposed to be. Now, because of injuries and ineffective play, the inconsistency of Devon House's availability,
Right.
Kevin King playing with a bad shoulder all year,
He was
they were
forced
forced
to
to
go
play
and
him
play him on the
outside,
perimeter, yeah.
and that was not his strength. But he still, to Bill's point, he was their best cover guy last season for the second half of the year after the whole thing against Chicago, which, if I recall, he said he didn't know what you were talking about when you asked him about it. But he was their best player. And again, I think it speaks to how they felt about him, that they were willing to move on from him for a backup quarterback
What penalty?
and switching
What
their
penalty?
4th and 5th round picks.
What penalty? Yeah. That was unbelievable. Kizer v. Hundley. What's going to happen?
Who knows?
Doesn't matter what happens unless he goes down with another collarbone, ankle, or other injury.
Obviously Hundley struggled last year, but Kizer wasn't very good at Notre Dame. I never understood the love of people had with
These
Kizer.
guys
He
were
was
ready to take him in round 2 last
he was
year.
a mid 50% passer at Notre Dame. I mean, geez, Louise, I
The
don't know.
argument with him is that if he stays in another year, instead of coming out when he did, that he maybe improves as a college player and has better draft status. At the same time, he got, and I understand they didn't win any of the games, but he did start 15 NFL games. Like, there's got to be significant value to that, regardless.
Had
And he got
moments,
paid.
a lot of turnovers, but
A lot of turnovers. But he's a tall, athletic, rangy
Sure.
quarterback that you hopefully is a lump of clay you can mold. So let's see what happens at quarterback school.
Yeah, it's not a guy that you need right away, hopefully.
All right, let's
you
talk
hope.
about the additions real quickly here, including, you mentioned Muhammad Wilkerson, Jimmy Graham, and Tremont Williams, the three newcomers signed by the Packers and Brian Gutekunst.
It's not a very long list of free agent signings, is it?
Who are you most excited about?
They said that, I mean, we heard the word aggressive, and look, Brian Gutekunst made it very clear that aggressive didn't necessarily mean they're going to sign a bunch of guys. He wanted to be in more conversations.
It's like the grief these fans have put up with Thompson saying you don't do anything in free agency. It's like he's never even made a phone call. They made offers to guys. Those guys just had better offers elsewhere.
And I think it's a good thing that they didn't go overboard, right? I mean, I asked Goody this at the NFL meetings if there was any temptation for him to want to make a big splash. You know, I'm the new sheriff in town and do something like that. And he said his focus was to improve the team as quickly as he could. I don't know if he succeeded in veteran free agency. I think he goes into the draft needing to have, and this is an unfair standard, but I think they need to have a kind of draft like the New Orleans Saints had last year, where they go out and get the offensive and defensive rookies of the year. They did not do that much to improve, and they're lucky that they have Aaron Rodgers, but they have some glaring needs going into Thursday.
That's the next segment. Hughes, real quick with you. We talked about the additions. Let's go to departures. Jordy Nelson waived in a cap move and signed quickly by the Raiders. Morgan Burnett to the Steelers. Jeff Janis to the Browns. Jeff, and Richard Rodgers to Philadelphia. No,
Are you
see, I'm really
heartbroken over
broken up
Jeff
about
Janis no longer on the team?
Some tough calls made there by Gooden.
Yeah, you know, I remember when they drafted Josh Jones last year, I said, well, there goes Morgan Burnett. It was like the instant they drafted him. Well, there goes
We all knew he was coming, dude.
Like, you know, everyone liked Morgan and he's the leadership and all that stuff, but the guy can't run or stay healthy anymore. I mean, it's time to move on there. And, you know, Jordy probably would have scored 10 touchdowns this year with the Packers, right? But he would just, you know, he's at the end of his rope. So tough decisions need to be made. They made them.
I think the one thing that I think will be hard is I don't know if whatever Jordy Nelson does in Oakland will be an accurate depiction of what he would have done here. So people might say, you know, if he has 50 catches in Oakland, people say, well, see, he's done.
He's on the way down.
I'm just not a believer in that. I'm a believer in Jordy Nelson with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback for 16 games is probably a 1,000-yard receiver still. He had 6 touchdown catches at the time of Aaron Rodgers' injury. They're going to need Jimmy Graham, who they added in free agency, to come in and have that kind of an impact in the red zone so they can have those kind of touchdowns that Jordy would have given them.
But how many times did Jordy catch the ball, get tackled immediately? And that's what
You're the
makes you
king
think
of the
that he's
yak.
done.
I know that. That's very
That's
important.
why
to you, and
Richard
you're right.
Rodgers, yards at catch, not yards after catch. I think Jordy's
One of his better lines.
Yeah, I think Jordy's 85 catch, 1,200-yard, 15 touchdown seasons are a distant memory, no matter where he plays, Green Bay included. All right.
Mark's wife, by the way, led protests in the street
Oh my
when Jordy
gosh.
Nelson was
She hates
let go.
Gutekunst for that move, right? But what can you do? Anyway, so.